That's why caffeine itself is very bitter, makes us feel tired because of the way that this natural pattern of adenosine making us sleepy. I'd like to just briefly talk about adenosine and some of its molecular features. And again, if you don't have a background in biology, don't worry. I promise to make this very clear to everyone. First of all, caffeine is what's called a methylxanthine. It's a plant alkaloid. That's why caffeine itself is very bitter. Again, if I were to give you just the tiniest little bit of pure caffeine, you would find it to be extremely aversive. And so these plants that have snuck small enough amounts of caffeine into them, or that have masked the flavor of caffeine with other flavors such that bees and humans want to consume them, while we don't know what plants think, it does seem very diabolical and very clever in that we are seeking out these caffeine-containing plants, beverages, and foods, even though caffeine itself is this alkaloid that is very, very bitter. Methylxanthine, that is caffeine, binds to adenosine receptors, and there are really two types of adenosine receptors. There are these so-called A1 receptors and the A2 receptors, and they're present in different parts of the brain and body at different levels. We don't have to get too far into receptor subtypes. More importantly to understand is that adenosine makes us feel tired because of the way that it taps into the ATP pathway. The ATP pathway is central to energy production and feelings of overall energy in our brain and body in all cells and organ systems. When caffeine binds to adenosine receptors, it prevents adenosine from breaking down certain components of the energy production pathway. And the net consequence of that is increased cyclic AMP. So basically, when we ingest caffeine, we are biasing our system towards the pro-energetic aspects of these cellular pathways. Now, it's really important to understand that in biology, even if you block a receptor or you prevent the activity of an enzyme, and at least in this case, you end up with more cyclic AMP, more energy, you're not really getting more energy. You're actually borrowing energy against an overall system that is frankly non-negotiable. What do I mean by that? Well, let's say that you were to wake up after 6 or 8 hours of sleep and to drink a lot of caffeine and keep drinking caffeine throughout the day, blocking those adenosine receptors. Yes, you'll offset fatigue. You'll offset sleepiness because that adenosine simply can't function. But at the point where the caffeine becomes dislodged from the adenosine receptors, you will have a massive glut, a backlog of adenosine, and you will feel extra sleepy. So really, there's no way to create more energy in your system. Really what you're doing is you're changing the timing in which the sleepy signals and the more energetic signals are arriving. And this is really important to understand as the backdrop to the various tools that we're going to get into next, in which you can use caffeine for enhancing mental performance and physical performance and other aspects of health. But it's very important to understand this concept that when you wake up in the morning, provided that you slept well and enough the night before, your levels of adenosine will be about as low as they will ever be. Actually, in order to get your adenosine levels really bottomed out, you want to avoid caffeine in the first 90 to 120 minutes after waking. We'll talk about why that is, because it turns out there's a way to completely clear adenosine out of your system in the hour or so after waking. But for most people, adenosine levels are going to be close to their lowest after a good night's sleep. But there's really no negotiating the accumulation of adenosine that's going to occur and going to bias you towards feeling more sleepy than you would otherwise. That's going to occur throughout the day. There's really no way to eliminate adenosine. All you can really do is block its function. So it's sort of like borrowing energy against the fatigue that you will inevitably feel. Now, this actually has very important socioeconomical relevance. Before caffeine was regularly consumed by human beings, we were really slaves to the light-dark cycle. And this was especially true before the presence of artificial lighting. But even before the advent of artificial lighting, humans were largely constrained to the outside light-dark cycle. We need to be active during the day and working during the day, and we need to be asleep at night. Caffeine allows us to divorce ourselves from that circadian cycle. Circadian just means about 24-hour. Caffeine allows us to do that at least somewhat by way of increasing our alertness, that is, spiking our alertness at various times throughout the day and even at night. This is how we can have shift workers, for instance, that can sleep during the day and then drink a strong cup of coffee at 8 p.m. and then work into the night. That ability completely transformed our society. Now, of course, the healthiest schedule, we know this with certainty, the healthiest schedule for brain and body is going to be alert during the daytime and asleep at night. There's no question about that. Shift workers run into all sorts of health problems. And thank you, shift workers, for doing the important work that you do. We need you, air traffic controllers, paramedics, firefighters, police officers, etc. But we know that there are serious health consequences, negative health consequences, that is, for shift workers. But for most people out there, about 95% of people follow a typical schedule where they're awake during the day and asleep at night. And yet it used to be, before the advent of caffeine-containing beverages, that if you were sleepy in the afternoon, you either had to take a nap or battle that sleepiness, that your activity rhythms and your sleep rhythms were governed by these circadian changes in availability of sunlight and when you slept. And you just didn't have the ability to ingest a beverage that would increase your levels of alertness because you block adenosine. So this is important to understand, that nowadays we certainly live in a time in which we use, in fact, 90% or more of adults and half or more of adolescents and teenagers use caffeine as a way to negotiate with, to borrow against this natural pattern of adenosine making us sleepy. But again, you're just offsetting the effects of sleepiness that adenosine causes. You can't eliminate the adenosine entirely. The important point is that adenosine as a pro-sleepy molecule is a non-negotiable aspect of your biology. In fact, it's so non-negotiable that every 24 hours, you are going to release adenosine, and you're going to release adenosine in direct proportion to how long you've been awake. So the longer you've been awake, the more adenosine circulating in your system. There are really only a handful of ways to completely clear out adenosine. The major one being to get sleep. The other is to take a short nap, which of course is sleep, but it's shallow sleep, or non-sleep deep rest, so-called NSDR, has been shown to reduce levels of adenosine. And there are certain things such as viewing morning sunlight, which, because of its effects on cortisol, can quote unquote clear out adenosine. We'll talk about this in more detail in a few minutes. And there's also evidence that certain forms of exercise, provided that it's brief and intense, can also reduce adenosine, not just block its effects. Now that